There is an interesting development that's going on in philosophy and science. In the previous video, I did talk about Einstein was wrong, that his philosophical assumption that the world functions under the principles that we call local realism. But thanks to the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics proving quantum mechanics once and for all, basically speaking, completing the picture of what reality consists of, although there's still a lot to learn about it, but at least now we know quantum mechanics is true without a doubt, making it one of the best theories in the world. It is basically the physics equivalent to Charles Darwin evolution by natural selection for biologists. It's something in this point, you cannot really refute anymore. But there is something very interesting. Because of the Bell's theorem, and Einstein was wrong about local realism, there is an interesting development. If we all know, there is a new scientific revolution that started in 2015 with the rise of AI, now having consciousness in the level of insects, early nanotechnology, the early quantum computing, and all the amazing stuff. But there's also the rise of philosophical at the same time. Why? There's a rise of idealism, dualism, non-dualism, also known as neutralism, and panpsychism. Although there are materialist versions of panpsychism, there's also idealist versions of panpsychism, right? But now with Bell's theorem and proving the universe non-local, but under the philosophical assumption by John Bell, if this is the case, well, now we know it's true, but there's a one specific area that has not been addressed yet. Thanks to the Bell experimentation, we had to abandon the assumptions, but we have three choices. Either 1. Abandon locality, 2. Abandon realism, or 3. Abandon both. No philosopher or scientist will abandon realism and keep locality. That is nonsensical. Instead, most scientists and philosophers by default are abandoning locality, now being non-local realists. My previous video is basically about the non-local realism, and this is the case. But what will happen if what if we're wrong about this? Both locality and realism is false. If realism is false, what is the alternative? Well, surprisingly, the alternative will be idealism. So is science moving away from materialism altogether? There's actually a possibility about this. Although I do not reach with this conclusion, my metaphysical and ontological position is on reductive physicalism. But if the Bell's theorem and new scientific studies in physics and to a lesser extent neuroscience suggest about the quantum correlation of consciousness, there is a possibility that if the idealism may be the case. There's also some evidence, at least philosophically speaking, that David Chalmers did with his new book Reality Plus, that even though he is a proponent of dualism, he has admitted in some case of his study about mind uploading, for example, or virtual reality, like the style of Matrix, this supports a naturalistic approach of interactionist version of substance dualism, which is a very interesting analysis. And also, if, and I say if, these studies or new studies are be to believe, and if this is the case philosophically, instead of dualism is non-dualism, also known as neutralism. This will be another interesting take. Although people will say that's some pseudoscience bullshit, only Zen Buddhists believe. It's like, okay, yeah, technically true if you believe in the supernatural, but there is a distinction between the idealist philosophy, although you don't have to be a non-dualist idealist at the same time. That's you can be one without the other. But what I'm saying is, like, these two things are completely different. Even linguistically speaking, they sound similar. They believe something that is in principle non-physical and are restricted to space-time, right? But the supernatural doesn't follow any rules whatsoever, while idealism at least has some rules of logic they have to follow, like the rest of philosophical schools of thought. So if everything is inherently mental, which some scientists actually believe, and if some studies are left to believe, space-time itself is doomed as well, because there is evidence against the idea that space-time is fundamental. So if this is the case, there is a good chance that idealism is a legitimate philosophical position that should be adopted in silence. And when it comes to panpsychism, there are many different types of panpsychism, but the only version of panpsychism that has any form of evidence that even Sabina Hostefer has admitted such, that is cosmopanpsychism, which some argue is no different than idealism. If this is the case, this is a very interesting phenomenon they are witnessing right now. So, not only that, now we know the universe functions non-locally thanks to Bell's theorem, but we also been proven other things, like for example the Winker's friend paradox has been proven as well. What does this mean? Well, now we know a specific interpretation of quantum mechanics is the correct one. Actually there are three interpretations that are proven to be correct. You may argue yourself, why three? Or should it be a contradiction? Not necessarily, because these three are compatible with one another. It's under different observations. For example, now we know that it's called the quantum information theory or quantum information science, which is a thing, such as it from bit. It's been called. If virtual reality stuff like that is a thing, if this is true, then the if from bit of quantum information is true, if not proven. Some argue, like the philosopher Timpson, who has said it, let us call thought that information might be basic category which all else flow informational immaterialism. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that we are witnessing. Another interpretation of quantum mechanics that is actually proven, the quantum information one, although technically proven, but the infra-bit part is like, it's like maybe, but we need more tests to go to prove it. But the only interpretation that has been proven is also not the most recent interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is relational quantum mechanics, developed by the Carlo Rovelli. Although in his new book Helgoland, he abandoned that and went to our the mystical Hindu, conception of nothing. It's like, seriously, it was kind of weird. It goes against everything that his own interpretation of quantum mechanics stands for. Another version, which is more of a variation of quantum information and the relational, is quantum Bayesianism, which again it shows that reality is basically what you observe it. It's not really out there anymore. You may call this participatory realism, but again, this is more of a debate among philosophers about details, so to speak. And also the von Neumann-Wiener interpretation, also known as consciousness collapse interpretation, which is another interesting thing, because now we know Winker's friend experiment is true. This may cause some really weird understandings about how reality works. For me, the only way to prove once and for all, like with little to no debate, if we do how do I say it? There's a certain proposed experiment that has not been put into practice, but if put into practice, right, it will be change change everything what we know about consciousness in reality. This is called by the proposal to use humans to switch settings in a Bell experiment by Lucia Hardy. In the book Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness for Quantum Mechanics, said in its abstraction introduction, in the proposal I described performing an experiment to test Bell's inequality, where humans are used to change their settings at two ends. The basic idea is that we perform a Bell's experiment over a scale at about 100 kilometers and have to each end about 100 humans to intervene on the setting via electrical brain activity obtained by electrode placed on their scalp to intervene on the setting, and it is done in recording an electroencephalogram or EEG. When we want to have a large number case when the setting has been changed, humanly interventions at both ends will signal as to the new value of the setting cannot have yet reached the other side. We suggest using EEG brain activity rather than, for example, pressing a button by hand to minimize delay. We need the experiment to be over a large distance scale and to have many humans at each end to get sufficiently high rate and that could be expected a significant event. Having some humans at each end will increase the rate. Making the experiment longer is also good as long as we have a high enough coincidence count rate that we can still get significant effect. The parameters suggest above 100 kilometers with 100 people at each end may be insufficient or more than sufficient for our purposes. The radical possibility we wish to investigate is that when humans are used to decide the settings rather than various types of random number generators, we might then expect that we to see a violation in quantum theory in agreement with the relevant Bell inequality. Such a result, while very unlikely, will be tremendously significant for our understanding of the world. A violation of quantum theory under the circumstances will of course be very important in and of itself, would teach us what the world was after all. Fundamentally local as well as having implication for determinism as we'll discuss. Although I personally will not discuss this, but let's continue. But the real importance of such results will be demonstration that humans have a special role we compare with computers, machines, and random number generator, as we will discuss later. A natural explanation of such result will be that it demonstrates some sort of Cartesian mind-matter duality, though one could seek out other types of explanations. Possible radical implications aside, before an experiment like this will push the development of new technologies. The biggest possible would be to get a sufficiently high rate if there's been a human-induced switch at each end before a signal as to a new value of setting could be communicated to the other end, and at the same time a photon pair is detected. This will require us to distribute entangled pairs of systems at a high rate over a scale of at least a kilometers and possibly hundreds of kilometers. Additionally, we will have to develop fast electronic applicants to these kinds of experiments. The objective of performing this experiment will act as a stretch goal, pushing us beyond what we might otherwise attempt at building on what was already being experimented and achieved, without attempting to have human input into the switching. Even if the most likely scenario like quantum theory emerged unscathed, there could still be technological payoffs to prefer such experiments. Such as possible technological payoffs include 1. Develop even more robust and high-rate entanglement distribution schemes over great distances, and 2. Opening out the field of coupling human choices to quantum systems using EEG technology. The use of EEG signals to human choices in computers and robotics is already an active area of research. We can investigate possible applications of such technologies. In particular, there may be a security advantage to coupling human direction to apparatus in quantum cryptography. In particular, in device-independent cryptography, in which we assume they cannot be seen faster than the speed of light, there could be security payoff to implement locality conditions with respect to human intervention. And if this experiment was put into practice, it was first proposed in the 1980s, but nobody has done it yet because of the technical limitations at the time. Now, if this is to be done, if this is to be successful, it is possible that Cartesian substance dualism may be true. Now, I must add, this does not mean that the supernatural exists. Yes, the idea that you have a substance soul, for so to speak, may be true, but consistent with naturalism, or at least some form of scientific analysis and not based off scripture of any kind. Some religious people may say hooray for these experiments proving their beliefs, but they're not actually proving their particular beliefs. It's just proving that the philosophical position of substance dualism, or in this case, if these scientific discoveries and the new philosophical revival of these positions are true, then idealism, interaction and substance dualism, non-dualism, also known as Notchamanism, and panpsychism, to be more specific, cosmopanpsychism, are true. That does not mean that your religion is true at all. It does not mean that God exists at all. It does not mean your scripture exists at all. Those things are not proven. In fact, those specific claims of those religions in question is proven to be false over and over again. So, best case scenario, your beliefs may be true, but not in the way you expected. I'm gonna put links in the description of all the scientific evidence that may support idealism and all of these new philosophical position that goes against our current materialist philosophy, even though I am myself a materialist. But I also put book recommendations by actual philosophers and scientists or making a valid case. In fact, there's never been a academic book making a case for idealism in over 200 years. In fact, the first academically peer-reviewed published book for making a case for idealism for the first time since Hegel was in 2019, published by Bernardo Kastrup, who was a computer scientist who worked in CERN, and now he's a philosopher. He has a second PhD in philosophy, especially in philosophy of mind. And he, because of his unique combination of PhD in science and a PhD in philosophy, he has a good understanding in why he thinks idealism is true. He's not the first one. So I highly recommend to go to the description, read the books and new scientific evidence that may lead to a new paradigm shift in science of this, possibly speaking, although I doubt it personally, but possibly speaking, a post-materialist science, which is a very interesting development. So, if everybody watch this video, like, subscribe, share. I'll see you guys next time.